We are going to review an article that is supposed to have been leaked by a Google researcher. The title is "We Have No Moat and Neither Does OpenAI." The writer is supposed to be a researcher at Google. I have no idea who leaked the article onto the internet. Let's look at it. He is uncomfortable, and he says the uncomfortable truth is we aren't in a position to win this arms race, and neither is OpenAI. And where is the pressure coming from? He says, I'm talking of course about open source. Plainly put, they are lapping us. Things we consider major problems are solved and in people's hands today. Just to name a few, he goes on to name 4 scenarios in which the community is well ahead of what Google or OpenAI was able to do. 1. LLMs on a phone. People are running foundational models on a Pixel 6 at 5 tokens per second. Scalable personal AI. You can fine-tune a personalized AI on your laptop in an evening. Responsible release shouldn't be an open source strong point, but still, he says there are entire websites full of art models with no restrictions whatsoever, and text is not far behind. And about multimodality, the current multimodal science QA state-of-the-art was trained in an hour, and he's worried that while the researchers at Google and the big companies still hold a slight edge in terms of quality, the gap is closing astonishingly quickly. And the part I've underlined in green, open source models are faster, more customizable, more private, and pound for pound more capable. This is the crux of the matter. And he says they are doing things with $100 and 13 billion parameters that we struggle to do with $10 million and 540 billion parameters. And they are doing so in weeks, not months. And this has a profound implication for Google and probably even OpenAI. He has realized that they have no secret sauce to offer when the advancement in open source are this fast and this frequent. The second point is that people will not pay for a restricted model when free and restricted alternatives are comparable in quality. And finally, the nail in the coffin is giant models are slowing Google down. That's his opinion. He says, in the long run, the best models are the ones which can be iterated upon quickly. We should make small variants more than an afterthought now that we know what is possible in the less than 20 billion parameter regime. And astonishingly, that knowledge is from the open source community developing those applications in a quick, rapid fashion. This chart summarizes the speed at which open source products are coming out. You have the LLaMA model, which was developed by Meta AI, and the weights were released, I think, by mistake onto the internet. Then you have Alpaca, 13 billion parameters, coming in just 2 weeks later. And another week later, you have Vicuña, 13 billion parameters. The thing about these releases is not the models themselves, it's how capable they have become. LLaMA was 68% of ChatGPT by some benchmark. Alpaca was 76% on the same benchmark, and Vicuña is 92%. With this rate of progress, it's only a matter of time that you'll have a small model beating ChatGPT in the benchmarks at the very least. In all that time, Bird was stuck at 93% of ChatGPT. And so, with the title, What Happened?, he goes back and reiterates the happenings between the time Meta released, or rather leaked, the weights of their models onto the internet and what followed. what is abundantly clear is that what was holding back open source was not the will or even the manpower. It was the lack of good foundational models to work on. And that problem was solved in the beginning of March when Meta's LLaMA weights were leaked to the public. Those models had no instruction or conversational tuning. They had no reinforcement learning, human feedback. They had nothing. And when this article was written, it was a month later, and there were already variants of the model that had instruction tuning, had quantization, had quality improvements, had human evaluations, had multimodality, had reinforcement learning, human feedback, and all those things in the space of just slightly over a month. And he says here, most importantly, they have solved the scaling problem to the extent that anyone can tinker. Many of the new ideas are from ordinary people. The barrier to entry for training and experimentation has dropped from the total output of a major research organization to one person, an evening, and a beefy laptop. The problem of AI has just been redefined to one of seeing how much you can do with a laptop, a relatively small large language model, and some ingenuity. He goes on to say that with this title, he goes on to say why we could have seen it coming, and it's because that this moment had come before. There was a stable diffusion moment that had happened before this, and the same community had worked very quickly and improved on the open source versions of these large language models to very great effect. He makes a very interesting observation here. In both cases, the case of stable diffusion and the case of the LLaMA models, low-cost public involvement was enabled by a vastly cheaper mechanism for fine-tuning called low-rank adaptation, or LoRa, combined with a significant breakthrough in scales, the latent diffusion for image analysis and chinchilla for LLMs. In both cases, access to a sufficiently high quality model kicked off a flurry of ideas and iteration from individuals and institutions around the world. In both cases, this quickly outpaced the larger players. So you can see here, he's saying this is not the first time this has happened, and that they should have learned the first time. And so he says these contributions from the open source community were pivotal in the image generation space, setting stable diffusion on a path different from DALL-E. Having an open model led to product integrations, marketplaces, user interfaces, and innovations that didn't happen for DALL-E. So in this case, it's clear that not backing up or working with the open source community is a hindrance to innovation. And for the case of image models, he says here the effect was palpable. Rapid domination in terms of cultural impact versus the OpenAI solution, which became increasingly irrelevant. Of course, he does not predict that for large language models, but he says this is something they could learn from. So he goes on to reiterate what they were missing and how they could have noticed it in the detail. Then he also talks about the one thing that big companies do all the time is to retrain models from the start for each iteration of research for most of the time. And he says that is expensive, and given these innovations from the open source community, or at least their way of working, it's unnecessary, which is low rank factorization of model matrices. He goes on to expound about the LoRa representation of model updates. Starting from the title, LoRa is an incredible powerful technique we should probably be paying more attention to. Then he explains the working of LoRa. And he says LoRa works by representing model updates as low-rank factorization, which reduces the size of the update matrices by a factor of up to 7,000. This allows model fine-tuning at a fraction of the cost and time. And he concludes the paragraph by saying the fact that this technology exists is underexploited inside Google, even though it directly impacts some of our most ambitious projects. And so here in this paragraph, he is saying essentially Google should intentionally do what Meta AI did by mistake to improve Google's technology. And because they are not employees, it will be essentially free labor for Google. In fact, here is where he hammers in that Google is essentially shooting themselves in the foot. He says, the more tightly we control our models, the more attractive we make open alternatives. Google and OpenAI have both gravitated defensively towards release patterns that allow them to retain tight control over how their models are used. But this control is a fiction. Anyone seeking to use LLMs for unsanctioned purposes can simply take their pick of the freely available models. And so he suggests some avenues for collaboration. He says Google should establish itself as a leader in the open source community, taking the lead by cooperating with rather than ignoring the broader conversation. This probably means taking some uncomfortable steps like publishing the model weights for small ULM variants. This necessarily means relinquishing some control over our models, but this compromise is inevitable. We cannot both drive innovation and control it. And so, how does this conclude? He says in the epilogue title, what about OpenAI? All this talk of open source can feel unfair given OpenAI's current closed policy. Why do we have to share if they won't? But the fact of the matter is, we already are sharing everything with them in form of a steady flow of poached senior researchers. Until we stem that tide, secrecy is a moot point. There are a lot of papers from Google where you clearly see that the lead author is now with OpenAI. So reading the second paragraph here, and in the end, OpenAI doesn't matter. They are making the same mistakes we are in their posture relative to open source, and their ability to maintain an edge is necessarily in question. Open source alternatives can and will eventually eclipse them unless they change their stance. In this respect, at least we can make the first move. I don't know about this, but I think OpenAI got the right partner in Microsoft. Microsoft is also a company that has a fairly measured acceptance of open source. So maybe that's a good thing. And also that they have 10 billion investment in their work from Microsoft. Yeah, they probably have some money to weather some storms that would come in the near future. But in the long term, they might have to raise a lot of money because they need to stay far ahead of Google. And to do so, they need to keep buying these people who make discoveries and pay them a lot of money. So that's a lot of financial bleeding, which they have to accept, along with the research, along with all the other things that they have to do to stay ahead. I think they might make it. Source of the article is semianalysis.com. You can go there using this URL that you can see on the top of your screen. See you in the next video, and thanks for watching till the end.